But at the same time, it gave me pause to consider some of the elements of Buddhism that I found kind of, difficult to comport with the DMT work, which part of it was the external reality of the DMT worlds as opposed to them just being, toxic byproducts of the mind, which was the main part. Also, just the importance of the concept of God as well, which was kind of pushed under the rug in most, Buddhist communities. It was a painful ejection from Zen, but at the same time, it gave me the opportunity to return to my own roots and find some both, spiritual solace and some interesting insights that I've been able to apply professionally too.
Wow. I wanted to say one more thing about one thing about the movie that I really loved, a statement that was one of my favorites, was when Leanne Standish talks about consciousness manifesting matter and not the other way around. Isn't that cool? That you can experience that.
Well, with that, maybe we should open up the questions to the audience. And, yeah.
Thank you for researching and creating what you do. And so I wonder, as DMT is released in our brains when we leave or pass on or die, as people say, how does the use of DMT when we're alive in this life affect our last journey? Do you know anything about this?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question. One of the major problems of my book has been that, people have kind of taken as truth a lot of the speculation that I included in the book. And some of that speculation has got to do with the DMT, production in the pineal. There's a lot of circumstantial evidence, supporting that, but we still don't know for sure if the pineal makes DMT. That's, been sort of bitten me in the butt over the years, is that it's become kind of urban wisdom, but it's just not true. We still don't know. But I think within 6 months we'll probably know, because I'm working with a group in Louisiana that's developed a new means of being able to measure DMT, and we're going to start looking at the pineal. And also, we really don't know if DMT increases when you die, or when you're near death, or when you dream, or when you're meditating, or when you're born. I do marshal a lot of circumstantial evidence in the book. All of the ingredients to make DMT occur in the pineal, the enzymes, the precursors. And we've worked out the genetic mechanism for the production of DMT in humans and in other animals. But we still don't really know the dynamics of endogenous DMT, if it goes up when you dream, if it goes up when you die. And one of the reasons is it's really hard to, to measure the levels of DMT that occur in ordinary consciousness. The concentrations are in the range of a few billionths per milliliter. So the kind of equipment that's required to be able to measure concentrations that low are extremely demanding. So,
do they exist? Do monitoring systems could you isotopize your DMT and have a brain scan while you were having the DMT experience, or measure levels of DMT that were modulated by certain experiences with a highly sensitive device?
Yeah. So you can label DMT, with some kind of radioactive tag, and you can give it to an animal, and you can measure activation or inhibition of particular brain sites, so that's possible. But But in terms of being able to measure levels of naturally occurring DMT, that's quite difficult. And so that's what we're working on now with the group at LSU.
One of the great quotes I read earlier this year from a scientist quoted in Scientific American, it was a visual physiologist, kind of a medical person, a neurophysiologist, and they said that everything that we experience is a figment of our imagination, basically. And for a neuroscientist to just be upfront and declare that as, it's kind of like you don't really even want to hear that, So we're just on this certain dosage level of DMT as human beings at this phase, and what happens when these experiences get cranked up, and do they get cranked up? You would kind of think that might bear out, but as the old stories about the DMT levels being elevated in people who've had this acute schizophrenic breaks, and that was later disproven supposedly.
So the so the studies with schizophrenia have panned out, pretty much.
Oh, they.
Well, there's one study that's quoted a lot. The concentrations of DMT increase in schizophrenics if they're experiencing an increase in psychotic symptoms. So that's panned out fairly well over the years.
Okay, because I heard that was an urban legend as well.
No.
So there are elevated levels in a hallucinating psychotic, as one might imagine.
As compared to non-hallucinating psychotics.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, so how many of you are under the impression that DMT increases when you dream or die or those sorts of things? Yeah, and so how many of you are under the impression that DMT is made in the pineal gland? God. I'm sorry. Yeah, I thought I really bent over backwards to make the distinction. If there is no DMT in the pineal, still really doesn't, change anything about the importance of endogenous DMT. It's made in the lungs, to an extremely large extent. So even if the DMT and pineal connection doesn't come through, if it did, it would have been icing on the cake, and it still may come through. But it isn't necessary for understanding the nature and the role of endogenous DMT. We just don't know. Yeah, we just don't know. Yeah, if it's not DMT, it's something else. Obviously, there's got to be some correlate of those experiences within our bodies. Otherwise, they wouldn't be happening. So, it's DMT, it's 5-methoxy-DMT, which is elevated, some other compound that we haven't found yet.
DMT is broken down by monoamine oxidase. Number one, if someone's in the study of the other studies, not yours, as far as monoamine oxidase, if they're got a drug that has that as a side effect, and then you're measuring the DMT levels during their episodes, wouldn't there be a cumulative effect of DMT in people on monoamine oxidase inhibitors?
That's possible, and there were studies that took place giving people at MAO and compounds.
Antidepressants are monoamine oxidase.
Yeah. Well, there are a class of antidepressants which inhibit monoamine oxidase. Yeah, and in those studies, they were interested in determining if levels of DMT increased naturally because the endogenous breakdown was being inhibited. But those studies were also limited, by the sensitivity of the measuring instruments, and they really weren't able, to demonstrate
So
anything.
it's such a small balance at any given moment, the pushover trips it, and they won't find it anymore.
Right, yeah, yeah.
As far as, okay, so you talked about the measuring of DMT in the body and those things, but when it comes to the experience, I've read that in Mesoamerica, with the ayahuasca use, the ancient kingdoms and cities, the kings would have wars on DMT at different places, at the same time, knowingly. They would do it at a certain time. And then one of them would just die, and the kingdom would die. So I was wondering, do you have experimented with maybe having two subjects or more in different various places where they may encounter each other in this realm, where, if it is around, you can actually prove, or kind of prove, the actual experience rather than where the DMT is, and that would be working backwards from the consciousness giving physicality rather than physicality giving consciousness.
Well, yeah. So speaking of our actual study of giving DMT, we never gave two people the drug at the same time. Even if I was doing more than one study in the course of a day, I would study one person and kind of wrap up with them and then do somebody else. But yeah, we never gave it in groups, let's say. But in the ayahuasca field, there's a lot of stories about shared hallucinations of the group under the influence of ayahuasca. There's something else. Oh, yeah. Okay, I think I'll talk about something else later. But with respect to being able to measure the experience, somehow or another. If you think about the external reality of the DMT, of the DMT worlds, as opposed to them just being the brain on drugs, as it were, I think at some point, if those were external perceptions, or if those were the perceptions of an external freestanding reality, I think it ought to be possible to photograph people's DMT experiences somehow or another, and then compare them. Some kind of weird hybrid of brain scanning and quantum physics, or something like that. You can develop some instrument that you can snapshot.
I think Alex does that. Andrew Newberg, and I'm trying to, because he doesn't use DMT, but measuring brain states, right, with meditation or prayer or different things like that. But I think
Yeah, well, it's still kind of hard to tell with those brain scans. Is it the brain perceiving something out there, or is the brain being stimulated, to generate those perceptions? And I think it's conceivable, that we could develop some kind of camera at some point. Somebody on DMT is, describing this vision, and you can click and
Yeah, when we have nanoneurons that have little snap machines, and yes, save that one in the file. Well, that's always been the challenge: is how do you bring this message back? And so the cinema these days has developed more sophisticated tools, and the computer graphics have led to a revolution in a kind of psychedelic visionary worlds that have been appearing in recent cinema, and which you're, right in the wave of kind of new psychedelic films that I think are making people think of these experiences and substances in a new context. We need desperately a new context for these substances, and one that's respectful, like you've done. I think is a great service. Yeah.
So much research in psychedelics seems to just focus on the brain, as if this is the only organ that experiences these drugs. But I'm wondering, what your research showed with the heart. It seemed like as if you were doing a scientific research. So is there any data that you could see from monitoring different organs?